The dull hum of fluorescent lights filled the small dorm room as Matt Hayes stared at his laptop screen, pretending to read an article for his psychology class. His roommate, Jake Patterson, sat on the opposite bed, a grin spreading across his face as he laced up his sneakers. "Come on, Matt," Jake urged, his voice brimming with excitement. "You've got to come with me. Tonight. It's going to be epic." Matt sighed, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. "I don't know, man. I've got a ton of reading to catch up on, and I'm not really into the whole frat scene." Jake rolled his eyes, standing up and pulling on a hoodie. "That's exactly why you need to come. You've been here, what, 2 months? And all you do is study. Live a little, man. It's not just about the party, it's about meeting people, making connections." Matt hesitated, his gaze shifting from his screen to the window, where the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon. The thought of mingling with a bunch of rowdy frat boys didn't appeal to him, but Jake had a point. He hadn't really made any friends since transferring to this new university. The idea of spending another night alone in the dorm, surrounded by books and notes, felt equally unappealing. "All right, fine," Matt finally conceded, closing his laptop. "But just for a little while. I'm not staying out all night." Jake's grin widened, and he clapped Matt on the shoulder. "That's the spirit. Trust me, you won't regret it. This is going to be a night to remember." Matt forced a smile, but a gnawing feeling of unease settled in his stomach as they left the dorm room. He couldn't shake the sense that he was making a mistake, but he pushed the thought aside. After all, it was just a party. What could possibly go wrong? The evening air was cool and crisp as Matt and Jake made their way across campus. The path leading to the frat house wound through a part of town Matt hadn't yet explored. The buildings became more run down the further they walked, the streetlights flickering weakly overhead. The contrast between the lively campus and the desolate neighborhood was stark, and Matt found himself glancing over his shoulder more than once. "You sure this is the right way?" Matt asked, trying to keep the apprehension out of his voice. Jake nodded confidently. "Yeah, it's just a little off the beaten path. Keeps the cops from showing up, you know?" Matt wasn't entirely convinced, but he followed Jake as they turned onto a narrow street lined with dilapidated houses. The sound of distant music grew louder, and soon they arrived at the frat house, a large, sagging Victorian mansion that looked like it had seen better days. The front porch was crooked, the paint peeling from the walls, and the windows were dark, except for the occasional flash of colored lights from within. "It's something," Matt said, trying to mask his discomfort. Jake laughed. "Yeah, it's got character, right? Come on, let's check it out." They approached the front door, which hung slightly ajar, creaking ominously as they pushed it open. The music inside was loud, the bass reverberating through the floorboards. The hallway they stepped into was dimly lit, the only illumination coming from a few flickering bulbs. Overhead, the walls were lined with faded wallpaper, and the air was thick with the scent of stale beer and sweat. "Welcome to the party," Jake said with a grin, leading the way deeper into the house. As they walked, Matt couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The house seemed alive, as if it were watching them, waiting for something. He tried to ignore the sensation, telling himself it was just his nerves, but the unease lingered. The hallway opened up into a large, crowded living room, packed with students dancing, drinking, and shouting to be heard over the pounding music. The room was dimly lit by a few string lights hanging from the ceiling, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move on their own. The furniture was old and mismatched, and the floor was sticky with spilled beer. Jake immediately spotted some people he knew and disappeared into the crowd, leaving Matt standing awkwardly by the entrance. He scanned the room, trying to find a friendly face, but Everyone seemed engrossed in their own conversations or too intoxicated to care about a newcomer. He wandered to a table covered with red plastic cups and bottles of cheap liquor, grabbing a cup of beer in an attempt to blend in. Sipping the warm, flat beer, he couldn't help but feel out of place. This wasn't his scene, and the oppressive atmosphere of the house only heightened his discomfort. As he leaned against the wall, contemplating an early exit, a man approached him. He was tall and thin, with slicked-back black hair and piercing green eyes that seemed to glow in the dim light. He wore a dark, nondescript outfit that somehow made him stand out even more among the partygoers. "Enjoying the party?" the man asked, his voice smooth and confident. Matt shrugged, forcing a polite smile. "It's all right, I guess. Not really my thing." The man chuckled, a sound that sent a shiver down Matt's spine. "You just need to loosen up a bit. Here, try this." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, silver flask, offering it to Matt. Matt hesitated, eyeing the flask warily. "What is it?" "Just something to help you relax," the man said with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Trust me. You'll feel a lot better after a sip." Something about the man's demeanor made Matt uneasy, but he didn't want to seem rude. He took the flask, unscrewed the cap, and took a cautious sip. The liquid inside was surprisingly sweet, with a sharp burn that followed, warming him from the inside out. "Not bad," Matt said, handing the flask back. But as he did, he noticed the man's eyes narrowing slightly, his smile growing wider. "See? You're already feeling better," the man said, his voice almost a purr. "Stick around. The night's just getting started." Matt nodded, though his unease only grew. He couldn't put his finger on it, but something about this whole situation felt wrong. He decided to stick with his original plan, stay for a little while, then make an excuse to leave. As Matt moved away from the man, the effects of the drink began to take hold. The room seemed to warp and twist around him, the lights growing dimmer and the shadows longer. The music, once loud and overwhelming, now sounded distant and distorted, like it was coming from underwater. Matt blinked, trying to clear his vision, but the dizziness only intensified. He reached out to steady himself against the wall, but his hand passed through empty air. Panic surged through him as he realized he was losing control. The man's voice echoed in his ears, though he couldn't see him anymore. "Just let go, Matt. Stop fighting it." Matt's heart raced as the room continued to spin, the walls closing in on him. He tried to focus, to find a way out, but his legs gave way, and he collapsed onto the floor. The last thing he saw before everything went black was the man's face hovering above him, that predatory smile still fixed in place. Matt's consciousness flickered back into existence slowly, like a dying light bulb struggling to stay on. His head throbbed with a dull, persistent ache, and his mouth was dry, his tongue feeling like sandpaper against his teeth. For a moment, he couldn't remember where he was or how he'd gotten there. He opened his eyes to find himself in complete darkness. Panic flared as he realized he couldn't see anything, not even his own hand in front of his face. The air was cold and damp, carrying the faint scent of mold and decay. Matt pushed himself up, his hands brushing against a cold, hard surface. Wood, maybe. He was lying on the floor of what felt like a small, enclosed space. His mind raced as he tried to piece together what had happened. The party, the man, the drink. How had he ended up here? He stood up slowly, his legs unsteady beneath him. He reached out, feeling along the walls until his fingers brushed against something metallic, a doorknob. Relief washed over him as he turned the knob, but the door didn't budge. He jiggled it, pushed it, but it was locked tight. "Hello," he called out, his voice echoing back at him in the darkness. Is anyone there? There was no answer, only the oppressive silence pressing in from all sides. Matt's heart pounded in his chest as he fumbled in his pockets, searching for his phone, but it was gone along with his wallet and keys. Panic clawed at him, but he forced himself to stay calm. There had to be a way out. As he continued to search the room, his hand brushed against something soft, a curtain. He pulled it back, revealing a window, though the glass was so dirty he could barely see through it. What little light filtered in from outside was dim and gray, giving him just enough visibility to make out the shape of the room. It was small, cramped, and devoid of furniture, save for a single, rickety chair in the corner. The walls were bare, peeling paint revealing patches of rotting wood beneath. The air was thick with dust, making it hard to breathe. Matt pressed his face to the glass, squinting to see outside. But instead of the street or the frat house's front yard, he saw only darkness. No buildings, no streetlights, nothing but an empty void stretching out as far as he could see. A cold chill ran down his spine as he realized he wasn't in the frat house anymore. Wherever he was, it was far from the party, far from anything familiar. And he was trapped. Matt's mind raced as he tried to think of a way out, but the fear gnawing at him made it hard to focus. The room was stiflingly silent, the kind of silence that made your ears ring. It was so quiet that when he finally heard the sound, a faint rustling, like fabric brushing against something, it felt like a gunshot. He spun around, his eyes straining in the dim light, searching for the source of the noise. His heart pounded in his chest as he saw the closet door slowly creaking open, inch by inch. "Who's there?" Matt demanded, his voice trembling despite his effort to sound brave. The door opened wider, revealing nothing but darkness inside. Matt's breath caught in his throat. As the rustling grew louder, more insistent, as if something or someone was moving within the shadows. He took a hesitant step forward, reaching for the closet door. His hand shook as he grasped the edge and pulled it fully open. The closet was empty, no clothes, no boxes, nothing. But the rustling continued, coming from deep within the darkness that seemed to stretch back further than it should. As he stared into the void, Matt felt something brush against his arm, cold and soft, like a hand. He jerked back with a yelp, his heart hammering in his chest. But when he looked down, there was nothing there. Panic surged through him, and he turned back to the door, pounding on it with both fists. "Help! Somebody, please, let me out." The room remained silent, the only response the echo of his own voice. Matt's fists throbbed from the impact, but he kept hitting the door, desperate to escape the creeping horror that seemed to be closing in on him. Finally, the doorknob rattled and the door creaked open on its own. Matt stumbled back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He stared at the door, now ajar, leading into a dimly lit hallway he didn't recognize. Gathering what little courage he had left, Matt stepped into the hallway, his heart still racing. The door behind him swung shut with a soft thud, sealing him off from the room and whatever had lurked within. The hallway stretched out before him, long and narrow, with doors on either side. The air was thick with a musty, old smell, and the dim light cast strange shadows on the walls. Matt felt a sense of dread settle over him as he realized he had no idea where he was or how to get out. He took a deep breath and started walking, hoping to find some sign of escape. But with each step he took, the hallway seemed to stretch on forever, the doors blurring together as if they were all the same. It wasn't long before he realized he was lost in a place that shouldn't exist, trapped in a nightmare that was only just beginning. Matt stood at the edge of the hallway, his mind still reeling from the bizarre events of the night. The air was colder now, almost biting, and the dim light bulbs overhead buzzed with a faint, unnerving hum. The hallway stretched out before him, Impossibly long and narrow, it's faded. Wallpaper peeling away to reveal dark, moldy patches beneath. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, but the door behind him had vanished, leaving him with no choice but to move forward. He took a tentative step, and the floor creaked loudly beneath his weight, the sound echoing down the corridor. As he moved further into the hallway, the sense of being watched intensified. The shadows seemed to shift and stretch, as if alive, and the flickering light cast strange, distorted shapes on the walls. His heart pounded in his chest, and his breath came in shallow, quick gasps. The further he walked, the longer the hallway seemed to become, as though it were stretching into infinity. Matt's sense of time and space began to warp, and he found it harder and harder to keep his bearings. The oppressive silence pressed down on him, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards or the distant sound of something scurrying behind the walls. Then, he heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping sound. He stopped, straining to listen. The tapping was soft at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder with each passing second, like the steady beat of a metronome. It seemed to be coming from behind one of the doors up ahead. Matt hesitated, his heart pounding in his ears. Every fiber of his being told him to ignore the sound, to keep moving, but his curiosity and fear compelled him to approach the door. With a trembling hand, he reached out and grasped the cold, brass doorknob. He turned it slowly, and the door creaked open, revealing a small, dimly lit room beyond. The room was starkly different from the decaying hallway. It was eerily pristine, as if frozen in time. The walls were a pale, sickly yellow, and the floor was covered in a faded, floral-patterned carpet that muffled Matt's footsteps as he stepped inside. A single, flickering candle sat on a small, round table in the center of the room, its weak flame casting dancing shadows on the walls. Matt glanced around, his eyes landing on a large, heavy curtain that hung over a window on the far side of the room. The rhythmic tapping that had drawn him here had stopped the moment he entered, leaving an unsettling silence in its wake. He felt a strange compulsion to see what lay beyond the curtain, though every rational thought in his mind screamed at him to leave. Taking a deep breath, he approached the window, his footsteps soft on the carpet. He reached out, fingers brushing against the heavy fabric, and pulled the curtain aside. What he saw sent a chill down his spine. The window looked out into a void, an empty, black expanse that seemed to stretch on forever. There was no street, no trees, no sky, just an endless, yawning darkness that swallowed everything. Matt's stomach twisted as he stared into the abyss, his mind struggling to comprehend the sight. He was no longer in the frat house or anywhere remotely normal. This place, whatever it was, existed outside of reality. The tapping sound returned, louder and more insistent, coming from directly behind him now. Matt whipped around, his heart leaping into his throat. The door he had entered through was closed, but the sound was unmistakable. Something, or someone, was on the other side. The tapping grew louder, more frantic, and the doorknob began to rattle violently. Matt backed away, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew he should run, but there was nowhere to go. The window led to nothingness, and the door was blocked by whatever was trying to get in. The doorknob stopped rattling, and for a moment, the room was deathly silent. Then, the door slowly creaked open, revealing the darkened hallway beyond. Matt squinted into the darkness. But he saw nothing, just the empty, black corridor. He took a hesitant step toward the door, his breath hitching in his throat. But as he moved closer, a figure began to emerge from the shadows, a tall, gaunt shape that seemed to glide rather than walk. Its features were obscured by the darkness, but its presence was unmistakably malevolent. Matt froze in place, his body trembling with fear. The figure moved closer, its outline becoming clearer in the dim light. It was vaguely human, but its proportions were all wrong. Its arms were too long, its fingers unnaturally thin, and its head tilted at an odd angle, as if it were studying him. Who are you?" Matt stammered, his voice barely a whisper. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it extended one of its long, bony fingers and pointed directly at him. Matt's blood ran cold as he realized that the figure's eyes, glowing faintly in the darkness, were locked onto his. He took a step back, his heart hammering in his chest. The figure's finger followed him, its movements slow and deliberate, as if taunting him. Matt's mind raced, but he couldn't think of anything to do. He was trapped, cornered by this terrifying entity with no means of escape. Just as the figure took another step toward him, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. Matt jumped, his pulse spiking as he realized the figure was gone. The door, now closed, blocked his view of the hallway, leaving him alone in the room once more. For a long moment, Matt stood frozen, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The only sound was the rapid thudding of his own heartbeat in his ears. When he finally gathered the courage to move, he bolted toward the window, desperate to escape the room and whatever horror lurked beyond the door. But the void outside offered no solace, only an endless, inky blackness that promised nothing but oblivion. Matt knew he couldn't escape that way, but he couldn't stay in the room either. With trembling hands, he reached for the doorknob and slowly turned it, half expecting the figure to be waiting for him on the other side. When the door creaked open, he found the hallway just as dark and empty as before. Steeling himself, Matt stepped out into the corridor, his nerves frayed and his senses on high alert. The door closed behind him with a soft click, sealing him off from the room and whatever haunted it. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, and began walking down the hallway once more. But now, every step felt heavier, every shadow more threatening. The house was no longer just a place, it was a living, breathing entity, and it had its sights set on him. As Matt moved through the hallway, it became increasingly apparent that the house was shifting around him. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting as if alive, and the floor beneath his feet felt unstable, as though it could collapse at any moment. The hallway twisted and turned, growing narrower with each step, until Matt felt like he was being funneled toward something, a destination he had no desire to reach. His breath came in shallow gasps as he tried door after door, hoping to find a way out. But every door was locked, and the walls seemed to close in on him, narrowing the hallway even further. Panic began to set in as Matt realized that the house was actively working against him, trapping him in its maze-like interior. He could hear the distant sound of footsteps echoing through the hall, slow, deliberate, and growing closer with each passing second. Matt's heart raced as he quickened his pace, desperately searching for an escape route. But the hallway continued to shift and change, leading him in circles and dead ends. The walls around him pulsed and twisted, the light overhead flickering wildly. Matt's fear escalated into full-blown terror as he realized he was completely at the mercy of the house, with no way to fight back. The footsteps were closer now, almost right behind him, and he knew he couldn't outrun whatever was following him. Finally, Matt spotted a door slightly ajar at the end of the hallway, with faint light spilling out from within. It was his only chance. Without hesitation, he sprinted toward it, his breath ragged and his legs burning with exertion. He reached the door just as the footsteps were almost upon him and threw himself inside. Slamming the door shut behind him, he leaned against it, gasping for air, his heart pounding in his chest as he listened for any sign of pursuit. But the footsteps had stopped. The hallway was silent once more, and the only sound was the rapid thudding of Matt's own heartbeat. He had escaped, for now. Matt took a moment to catch his breath, his back pressed against the door as he tried to steady His nerves. When he finally looked around, he found himself in a large, open room bathed in an eerie red light. The walls were lined with old, tattered tapestries, and the floor was covered in a thick, blood-red carpet that muffled his footsteps as he moved further into the room. In the center of the room stood a massive, ornate mirror, its surface cracked and covered in a layer of dust. The mirror seemed out of place in the otherwise decayed surroundings, its intricate frame adorned with strange, unreadable symbols. Matt approached the mirror cautiously, his reflection warped and distorted by the cracked glass. As he stared at himself, he noticed something unsettling. His reflection wasn't quite right. It moved independently, as though it had a mind of its own. The longer he looked, the more twisted and grotesque his reflection became, until it was a nightmarish version of himself, grinning back at him with sharp, pointed teeth. A wave of nausea swept over him, and he tore his gaze away from the mirror, but the unsettling feeling persisted. The room felt wrong, like it was closing in on him, suffocating him with its oppressive atmosphere. The red light flickered, casting strange, shifting shadows on the walls, and the air grew thick with the scent of decay. Matt knew he had to leave the room, but every exit was obscured by the red light and the thick carpet. He felt a strong, almost magnetic pull toward the mirror, as if it were drawing him in, calling him to come closer. The twisted reflection seemed to beckon him, its grin widening with each passing second. Against his better judgment, Matt reached out to touch the mirror's surface. His hand hovered just inches away, the air around it crackling with a strange, unnatural energy. As his fingers brushed against the cold glass, a sharp, icy pain shot through his body, and the mirror's surface rippled like water. The twisted reflection lunged toward him, and Matt yanked his hand back, stumbling away from the mirror. The room seemed to shudder, and the red light intensified, filling the space with a blinding, fiery glow. The mirror cracked further, the symbols on its frame glowing with an ominous light. Just as the room was about to collapse around him, Matt spotted a door on the far side of the room. With every ounce of strength he had left, he bolted toward it, throwing it open and leaping through just as the room erupted in a burst of blinding light and deafening sound. Matt landed hard on the floor, the impact jolting through his body as he struggled to catch his breath. The door behind him slammed shut, sealing off the red room and the horrors within. He lay there for a moment, his mind reeling from the chaos and terror he had just escaped. When he finally gathered the courage to stand, he found himself in yet another dark, narrow corridor. This one was different from the previous hallways. It was damp and cold, with water dripping from the ceiling and pooling on the floor. The walls were slick with moisture, and the air was thick with the smell of mildew and rot. Matt's heart sank as he realized he was descending deeper into the bowels of the house, moving further away from any hope of escape. The corridor seemed to slope downward, leading him into an even darker, more foreboding place. But he had no choice, there was no turning back now. As he walked, the corridor grew narrower and steeper, the ceiling lowering until he was forced to crouch to avoid hitting his head. The darkness closed in around him, the walls pressing in from all sides. The sound of dripping water echoed in the confined space, creating a disorienting, claustrophobic atmosphere. Matt's fear reached new heights as he realized he was descending into the very heart of the house, the source of its malevolent power. The air grew colder with each step, and the darkness became almost tangible, like a living thing that sought to swallow him whole. Finally, the corridor opened up into a vast, cavernous space, its ceiling lost in the shadows above. The ground beneath his feet was slick and uneven, and the air was thick with a damp, musty smell. The only light came from a faint, eerie glow that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, casting everything in a sickly, greenish hue. Matt felt a deep, primal fear settle in his chest as he realized where he was. He had descended into the very core of the house, the place where its evil was strongest. He knew instinctively that whatever awaited him here would be far worse than anything he had encountered so far. But he also knew that he had no choice but to face it. Matt stood at the edge of the cavernous space, his heart pounding in his chest as the eerie glow from the walls cast unsettling shadows across the uneven floor. The air was thick with moisture, each breath heavy in his lungs. The vastness of the room before him was disorienting, and the oppressive darkness seemed to press in from all sides. He felt as though he were standing at the precipice of something far more sinister than anything he had yet encountered. He took a hesitant step forward, and the ground beneath him felt unstable, slick with moisture. The walls, lined with a faint, pulsating glow, seemed to close in as he moved, their texture shifting like something alive. The hallway leading into the cavern twisted and turned in ways that defied logic, and Matt could feel the house tightening its grip on him. It was as if the very structure of the place was warping, bending reality to trap him deeper within its confines. With every step he took, the hallway seemed to stretch and bend, the ceiling lowering until it brushed against the top of his head. The narrow walls squeezed in on him, forcing him to duck and weave as he navigated the twisting path. The further he went, the more disoriented he became. The floor beneath his feet was uneven, and every few steps, he had to catch himself from slipping on the slick surface. The air grew colder as he descended further into the bowels of the house. His breath came out in short, visible puffs, and the dampness clung to his skin like a cold sweat. He could hear faint echoes of his own footsteps reverberating off the walls, but there was something else too, a distant, rhythmic pounding that seemed to come from deep within the walls. It reminded him of a heartbeat, slow and deliberate, like the pulse of the house itself. Matt's nerves were fraying with each step. He had no idea where he was going or how deep this twisted labyrinth ran. Every door he passed was either locked or led to another winding corridor, and every turn brought him further from any semblance of safety. He was lost in a place that was shifting and changing with every move he made, a living nightmare that seemed intent on consuming him whole. Then, just as he thought he could go no further, he heard it, the faint sound of someone calling his name. It was distant, muffled, as if coming from behind one of the countless doors that lined the hallway. Matt's heart leaped into his throat. It was a voice he recognized, weak and desperate, Jake. The sound of Jake's voice was like a lifeline, pulling Matt out of his spiral of fear and confusion. He followed the sound, moving with renewed urgency as he navigated the twisting hallway. The walls seemed to shift and pulse around him, but he pushed forward, desperate to find his friend. Finally, he reached a door that was slightly ajar, with light spilling out from within. Matt hesitated. For just a moment, his hand hovering over the doorknob. His instincts told him that nothing in this house could be trusted, but he couldn't ignore the sound of Jake's voice, pleading for help. Taking a deep breath, Matt pushed the door open and stepped inside. What he saw stopped him in his tracks. The room was eerily familiar. It was an almost perfect replica of the dorm room he shared with Jake. The same worn-out furniture, the same posters on the walls, even the same clothes strewn haphazardly across the floor. For a moment, Matt wondered if he had somehow been transported back to the dorm, if everything he had experienced was just some horrible hallucination. But then he saw Jake. His friend was sitting on the bed, hunched over and clutching his head in his hands. His shoulders shook with silent sobs, and he looked up as Matt entered, his face pale and drawn, his eyes wide with terror. "Jake," Matt whispered, stepping closer. Jake didn't respond immediately. When he finally looked up, his eyes were glassy, as if he were looking right through Matt. "I don't know where I am," he muttered, his voice hollow. "I don't know how to get out." Matt's heart ached for his friend. He reached out, placing a hand on Jake's shoulder, but the moment he made contact, Jake flinched away as if he had been burned. "Jake, it's me, Matt," he said, trying to keep his voice calm. "We're going to get out of here. I promise." But Jake just shook his head, his eyes darting around the room in panic. "This isn't real," he whispered. "None of this is real." Before Matt could respond, the room around them began to shift. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting, and the light in the room dimmed to a sickly, flickering glow. The furniture warped and twisted, the familiar shapes melting into grotesque, nightmarish forms. The posters on the walls peeled away, revealing dark, oozing patches beneath. Jake's expression changed in an instant. His face twisted into a grotesque grin, and his eyes, once filled with fear, now glinted with a malevolent light. "You can't save him," the thing that looked like Jake sneered. "You can't even save yourself." Matt's blood ran cold as he stumbled back, his heart hammering in his chest. The thing that had taken Jake's form began to laugh, a high-pitched, manic sound that echoed off the walls, growing louder and more distorted with each passing second. Panic seized Matt, and he turned on his heel, sprinting out of the room and slamming the door behind him. He didn't stop running, even as the hallway twisted and turned around him, even as the walls seemed to close in, pressing him toward the ground. The laughter followed him, growing fainter but never fully disappearing, as if the house itself was mocking him. Matt's flight through the hallway led him deeper into the house's twisted labyrinth. The corridor narrowed further, forcing him to crouch and squeeze through increasingly tighter spaces. The walls pressed in from all sides, the air thick with a damp, suffocating scent. Each breath felt like a struggle, each step taking more effort as if the house itself was draining his energy. He reached a point where the hallway split into multiple paths, each one darker and more foreboding than the last. Matt hesitated, his mind racing with indecision. Every instinct told him that choosing the wrong path could mean the difference between life and death. But there was no way to know which way led to safety, or if safety even existed in this place. With no other options, Matt picked the path that seemed the least threatening and moved forward, his heart pounding in his chest. The corridor twisted and turned in impossible ways, leading him up steep inclines and down sharp descents, through tight, claustrophobic tunnels, and across narrow, crumbling walkways. The deeper he went, the more distorted the environment became. The walls were no longer solid, they pulsed and rippled like the surface of a dark, viscous liquid. Strange symbols and markings appeared and disappeared, glowing faintly before fading back into the darkness. The sound of the heartbeat was louder now, a deep, resonant thudding that seemed to come from all directions. The house was alive, and it was closing in on him. As Matt turned yet another corner, he found himself in a large, circular chamber. The walls were lined with what appeared to be ancient, decaying relics, broken statues, rusted weapons, and tattered banners that fluttered in an unseen breeze. In the center of the chamber was a massive, ornate altar, covered in strange symbols that glowed with a faint, eerie light. The chamber was oppressively quiet, the only sound the steady thumping of the house's heartbeat, pulsing in time with the glow of the symbols on the altar. Matt knew instinctively that this was the heart of the house, the source of its dark power. He could feel the malevolent energy radiating from the altar, a palpable force that threatened to overwhelm him. Matt approached the altar cautiously, his senses on high alert. The symbols on its surface pulsed with a rhythm that matched the thudding in his chest, as if the altar itself was alive. The air around it was thick with a dark, oppressive energy, making it difficult to breathe. He could feel the power of the house concentrated here, a force that twisted reality and fed on fear. As he neared the altar, he noticed something lying atop it, a large, ornate dagger, its blade glinting in the dim light. The hilt was adorned with strange, intricate carvings that seemed to shift and change as he looked at them, and the blade itself was stained with dark, dried blood. It was an object of immense power, and Matt felt a deep, primal fear just looking at it. Before he could react, a voice echoed through the chamber, low and menacing. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Matt spun around to find Ethan standing at the edge of the chamber, his tall, thin form barely visible in the dim light. His eyes glinted with a cruel amusement, and his smile was cold and predatory. "Ethan," Matt whispered, his voice trembling. "What is this place? What's happening?" Ethan stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate, as if savoring the moment. "This is the heart of the house," he said, his voice smooth and calm. "The source of its power. And you, Matt, you were chosen to be part of it." "Chosen?" Matt's mind reeled. "For what?" "To serve the house," Ethan replied, his tone almost reverent. "To become one with it. Just like I did." Matt took a step back, his heart racing. "You did this? You brought me here?" Ethan's smile widened. "I didn't bring you here, Matt. The house did. It saw your fear, your weaknesses, and it drew you in. You're exactly what it needs, what it craves." "No," Matt whispered, shaking his head. "This can't be happening. I need to get out of here." Ethan's expression darkened, and his voice took on a more sinister tone. "There's no escape, Matt. Not for you. Not for anyone who enters this house. You have two choices: submit to its will, or be consumed by it." Matt's stomach twisted with fear. "I won't do it," he said, his voice shaking. "I won't become part of this." Ethan's eyes gleamed with a cold, malicious light. "You don't have a choice."